Hi, I'm Keith Johnston, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, we're joined by Vice President and Principal Analyst Ian Bruce and Vice President and Research Director Mike Prue to discuss CMO tenure and the representation among Fortune 500 companies. Welcome, Ian and Mike.
Great to be here, Keith.
Keith, best day of my life. And how is it not? We're talking about CMOs.
Exactly. So we need to save this unicorn. So the question really here is, and I feel like we ask the question every other year, is CMO tenure really in free fall? Or is marketing being pushed out of the C-suite? We see lots of data. There's always an article about, this executive is in danger. But Ian, you started to uncover some of the nuances in this, and you specifically looked at Fortune 500 companies, and you found some interesting attributes that may or may not be impacting CMO tenure. So why don't you just kick us off with a little bit of the findings?
Sure, yeah. So we looked at 2023 Fortune 500 data for CMOs. We trawled through all of the Fortune 500 companies, and we looked at overall CMO tenure, and then we looked at how CMOs fare in different industries and with different business models, male and female CMOs. So we sliced and diced the data pretty thinly, deliberately, because one of the hypotheses we had going into this research was the global averages that are quoted incessantly about CMOs and their fortunes or misfortunes is actually pretty misleading. Once you get into the weeds of the data, which is important to do, you'll find that the lived experiences of CMOs depends entirely on what industry they're in, what business model their company has, B2B, B2C, B2B2C, and even whether they're a man or a woman. The tenure and representation of CMOs varies enormously by all these variables. So when you look at the global averages, ours, for what it is worth, is 4.1 years tenure, and 63% of the Fortune 500 have a senior marketing executive that reports directly to the CEO, which is in keeping with what others have found. That's what we found at the global averages, but those averages are incredibly misleading, and they hide a lot of detail that we're going to be exploring on this podcast.
Great. So there was a day that particularly B2C CMOs made the transition to CEO more often than not. Is that not true anymore? Because, marketing feels like, you understand the brand, you understand the customer, you understand the business at such a sophisticated level. Making the transition to CEO was fairly natural. Are we not seeing that anymore?
We're seeing it more and more. Look, I love that Ian took on this topic head on, because I think as an industry, we like to latch on to this artificial stat that says CMOs don't stay in their jobs. And that simply isn't the narrative. We look to lots of companies that have been tracking this for some time. Spencer Stuart, who I referenced in a report that I did last year on this, just said the narrative is all wrong, that the opposite is true about CMO tenure, that one of the reasons why 77% of them who leave their roles are either promoted or take on bigger roles at other companies is because of the fact that they have a lot of competencies that really flex into the bigger business acumen at organizations. And we have a very recent example, Keith, of this with Starbucks. Right. They just appointed former Pizza Hut CMO as their CEO. This guy came from Chipotle as the CEO, but he was a CMO at Pizza Hut and Taco Bell. And as a result, guess what? Starbucks, their stock price went up 20% following that announcement. So, that is a vote for marketing right there. And when you have CEOs that have marketing acumen, I would argue that they make some of the best CEOs because they're looking at their enterprises and how they go to market in a much more holistic way.
Yeah, and more often than not, they're a fairly dynamic leader, and like I said, they understand the brand, the customer. There's a lot of things there. So, Ian, go into this comparison to B2C versus B2B and the various reporting structures that you discovered in your research.
Yeah, sure. Let's actually start, if that's okay, with industries, because I think that's a good place to start. Then we can cut into business models. So if we look at the industry 10, which is the classic structure for looking at different verticals in these kinds of research reports, if you look at financial services and insurance, which is one of the verticals we looked at, 91% of the Fortune 500 in that vertical has a CMO in place, 91%. If you look at energy and mining as a vertical, 21% have a CMO in place. So there's a 70% variance in the data on whether or not you have a CMO at all. Forget about tenure for a moment. So by industry vertical, huge variations in the representation of CMOs. So these sort of broad discussions that we tend to have about the fortunes of CMOs, you're going to have a very different conversation if you're talking to a financial services person as opposed to somebody in energy and mining. It's just going to be very, very different. Then if you look at tenure, you see similar variations. For financial services and insurance, tenure is about 4.5 years, 4.4 years. Media, entertainment, leisure, and hospitality, another vertical we looked at, 2.6 years, much, much shorter. So again, huge variations when you look at the experiences of CMOs, different industries. When you look at representation by different business models, B2C, B2B2C, and B2B, the overall representation, you'll remember, was 63%. For B2B companies, it drops to 48%. For B2C companies, it's 84%. So again, huge variations by the business model of the company. It's hard to make these broad scale statements about CMOs when you look at the details. It's just really tough to do it. You've got to look at the details.
And that's something, Keith, that Ian's research did that we're not seeing in some of the other trades that are following this. But what Ian did was a deep dive into the nuance of this idea of tenure. And what this research revealed is that the nuance matters because it tells a slightly different story from what we've been hearing all along.
So let's go into the nuance even in the title. So over the years, we've seen, this evolution of the title to it would be, chief marketing and an experience officer. And then, of course, it went to chief experience officer because we know that we can't separate the brand and communications from the experience itself. Chief growth officers, most of these new titles were an evolution of the CMO in one form or another. What did your research find there, Ian? And then I'll probably go to you, Mike, because you actually did a report about this.
I'm glad you brought this up, Keith, because when I started this research, I actually thought it'd be pretty easy to do. And it turned out to be it was just really difficult. And it was difficult because I went in with this simplistic idea that, I was looking for a CMO or not. And what I quickly found is that there is a multitude of different job titles for the person that runs all of marketing and reports to the CEO. There's just all kinds of weird job titles. And it cuts across all the different business models and all the different industries. There is no pattern, actually. That said, of the 63% that had a CMO, 55% did have the titles of CMO. So there was, a 8% roughly that had different job titles. And yes, chief growth officer was a very common one. Head of marketing was another. There was just a lot of variation in how they described themselves. And I couldn't find a pattern by industry and I couldn't find a pattern by business model. It was quite interesting. Actually, I think it plays, Mike, into your thought about how mobile CMOs are. And I think the changing way that industry is thinking about how the head of marketing adds value to a company, they're starting to reflect that thought in different job titles that talk about growth, as an example.
So, Ian, talk to us about anything you saw with the most senior marketer in B2B. Is there some changes in the title there, or perhaps a new person for them to report to?
Yeah, so certainly anecdotally, we see a lot of changes. Looking outside the data, we see more and more B2B chief marketing officers or people with a similar job title reporting to the chief revenue officer, for example. We see that more and more, or we see them reporting to someone else, chief of staff, even in some companies. That is becoming perhaps a little bit more common anecdotally, I would say. In the data itself, B2B CMOs are the scarcest among the Fortune 500. And that's because in certain vertical industries, I mentioned energy and mining, they're just the rare exception. So there are some B2B segments where CMOs are, it's a very lonely job, actually. Um, there isn't a culture inside these industries of understanding the value or the purpose or the mission of marketing generally. Um, is that changing? If it is, it's not in our data and it's slow.
Yeah. Let's take it back to tenure again. We talked about your report said the average tenure in the Fortune 500 was 4.1 years. I don't remember it changing all that much over the last decade or so. Certainly when you see a dynamic shift in the economy or what have you, you may be rolling over CMOs faster. When things are good, they hold tight a little bit longer, although the market may be in such a way that the CMO is just going to another job because it's a growth opportunity. So let's get into that tenure thing a little bit. What are the nuances that allow that number to go up and down? And you mentioned industry, but there has to be some commonality, some correlation there.
I think some of it is industry. I think just to take a step back, Keith, I think it's the reason we're having this conversation and you're asking this question is because in our heads, we're comparing CMO tenure to the tenure of other C-suite executives. So we compare it to the CEO tenure. Spencer Stuart, that Mike mentioned, has a start of 7.2 years tenure for a Fortune 500 CEO, much, much longer. If you look at the average tenure for CFOs, it's about 4.5 years. So still a little longer than the CMO. The CMO from the C-suite perspective is at the lower edge of the tenure range. If you look at US workers overall, just to throw that out there, then the median tenure for US workers is 4.3 years. So it depends on your perspective and how you think about this. I'm in Mike's camp. I think that CMOs move for a variety of different reasons. And often it's of choice, and often it's because they're going to a better opportunity, the CEO role or something like that. So I think there's that factor definitely is playing out with chief marketing officers. In terms of is tenure falling dramatically? I think in people's sort of minds that is the reality. There's a cliff face and CMOs are falling off it. That is not the truth. CMO tenure is roughly static at about 4.1, 4.2 years, something like that for the last few years. We have to remember COVID and all the impact that has on stats like this, but broadly stated, it's roughly static.
What Spencer Stuart tells us in their 2024 CMO tenure study is that tenure for CMOs is stabilizing at an average of 4.2 years, which is just shy now of the entire C-suite average. So what this tells me is that this conversation about CMO tenure is becoming moot and very quickly. And, I would also tout Ian to say that Spencer Stuart's average for CMOs is 4.2 years. Your B2C CMO average in your report, Ian, was 4.2 years. Something that I found fascinating, though, that was divergent in the two data sets is that your report, Ian, revealed a pretty striking comparison in tenure between B2C CMOs and B2B CMOs. That wasn't the case in Spencer Stuart's data. And so I think it would probably behoove our listeners to understand the methodology and the rigorous methodology that you use to derive those numbers.
Yeah. And again, it wasn't straightforward. I went into this research thinking it would be, quick and easy. It was not. The way that we decided how to categorize these different companies in the Fortune 500, and keep in mind, Fortune 500 companies are very often large conglomerates, so they're complicated. The way that we determined how to categorize them is we looked at, their financial statements and where the majority of the revenue came from. We did apply some other logic around, the consumer face of companies and whether there was a logic there to categorize them as B2C. But primarily it was based on their financial filings. That's how we did it. And yes, there is a big discrepancy. In my head, I'd love to know your opinion, Mike, but in my head, the data feels right. I think the lived experiences of B2B CMOs, who is primarily who I talk to, is a little bit more fraught. They are a little bit more nervous. They recognize their shelf life isn't as long as some of their colleagues in other industries. But I would love to know what you think from a B2C perspective.
Something that I was thinking about as I was driving to the office this morning. So why is there that gap? You have B2B CMOs with an average tenure of 3.6 years, and we already mentioned B2C at 4.2 years. The one area that I thought of is whether or not it has to do with sort of the pace or the nature of the B2B CMO versus B2C. Or just in terms of the type of work that's being done. And, from a B2C standpoint, which is really my worldview, and, we talk to B2C CMOs all the time, these are individuals that are able to work directly with the end consumer, which comes with a lot of, fun and interest and intrigue, and it allows them.
Are you saying B2B isn't fun? Is that what you're saying?
And in my head, as the words are coming out of my mouth, I feel like I'm throwing shade on B2B CMOs, which I want to be careful and avoid. But you have to agree that in the B2C world, the opportunity for creativity is much more rich and rigorous. And, one quick anecdote just to try to dig myself out of this hole is I've had B2B CMOs do guidance sessions with me and also ask to be attached to our B2C service within Forrester because they want to be able to position their brands and their tactics in a much more B2C type environment. So something's going on there, and it might be worth exploring at some point.
I'll unpack what some of the data tells us. So we have data at Forrester that makes it pretty clear that when you look at things like the percent of revenue spent on marketing, they are very different numbers for B2B companies compared to B2C. B2C companies spend far more of their resources. They invest more in marketing as a percent of revenue than B2B companies. That is just the truth. And that logic, that investment strategy, and the reasons behind it, I think, argue the case of why CMOs are either in the driver's seat or not in different companies. And in B2C companies, I think I'm going to throw shade on myself here, it is less common for B2B CMOs to be in that driver's seat. I think that's probably true. And when you look at the industry data, again, going back to my data, companies that have a consumer face, many of the conglomerate financial services companies in the Fortune 500 have a strong consumer face, Bank of America, Visa, so on. They have long tenure, they have high representation, right? They spend a lot on marketing. When you look at some of the other industry sectors, energy and mining, far fewer CMOs, far shorter tenure, they spend very little on marketing. So I think it's about that culture of whether marketing is material and matters and is invested in, or not. And that's what's reflected in a lot of the data.
Yeah. And so everything you guys have been saying the last couple of minutes just makes a ton of sense to me. Let's maybe go away from the data for a minute, because I think you guys made a really great case. Is like, let's look at some of the nuances in there through some of your interviews, and you don't have to name names. Like, what do you think are the things that are really pushing this tenure thing back and forth, or actually providing new opportunities for CMOs to stay longer and make a greater impact, with the executive team?
I keep coming back to the relationship with the CEO. That has been the red thread that I've seen in terms of CMO job satisfaction. Does the CEO have their back or not, regardless of whether or not they directly report to that individual? And it's interesting because I've interviewed plenty of CMOs that have tenures that blow these averages out of the water. People that have been at their same company in a B2C CMO role for 10 plus years. And there's multiple of them. And they're happy, they're satisfied. And it is because of that relationship with the CEO that they feel as though their work matters and is being valued. Period. That's the key ingredient.
I would 100% agree with what Mike said. I think that is the key ingredient, is the relationship with the CEO and perhaps by extension the board, and the recognition that marketing provides, near and long-term value. The thing I would add, Mike, is certainly in the B2B world, increasingly the CFO comes up in these conversations. And I think a lot of CFOs are proactively engaging with CMOs to try and understand that value equation and try and understand and decompose what they hear from the sales organization and what they need to hear from the marketing organization. And in those conversations, I think a lot of leading companies are leaning into data, are leaning into an understanding of the sort of digital journey that a lot of buyers go on these days, and pulling a set of metrics from that landscape that give them a richer insight, which gives them a conversation to be had with a CFO about ROI. And that's happening more and more. And we're seeing a lot of B2B companies get more sophisticated about unearthing through data that hard ROI and being able to justify to the CFO budgets, headcount, and different ways of working. And that is particularly true of really scaled out companies that you would find in the Fortune 500 that have the resources to do this kind of work.
I also want to just come back to, Keith, your question around the notion of what keeps CMOs in their seats. And for those individuals that make the endurance play, what they're doing is constantly reinventing themselves. They are continuously committed to a learning agenda. What they're not doing is simply coasting in their roles. These are rock star individuals that are doing their damnedest to try to keep up with the changing media and technology landscape, which is hard to do because it is changing at breakneck speeds. These are individuals that are really, really curious. They lean in, they leverage their partners, and they put out the type of thought leadership, both internally and externally, that demonstrates that they are keeping pace with what's going on in the marketing landscape.
Yeah, and that reinvention, at the end of the day, ends up in just, great performance for the company, probably superior impact on the culture of the organization, and and that's valued. Like any role in the C-suite, actually, but particularly the exposure that marketing brings a greater level of responsibility. I spent nearly my entire career before coming to Forrester in brand advertising, and early on there was a lot of male CMOs. I would say that the last 15 years of my career, just anecdotally, I just experienced it was dominated by female CMOs. But Ian, you actually looked into this.
We did, and I would say of all the findings that I got out of this data, this is what surprised me the most, honestly. The first thing that surprised me, it wouldn't have surprised you, Keith, it sounds like, is the majority of CMOs in the Fortune 500 are women, 53% of them. I would not in a million years have guessed that, and largely because when you look at C-suite executive representation, CFOs, for example, it is absolutely terrible. And I had that logic in my head.
Meaning male dominated?
Male dominated. Female CFOs are 19% of the Fortune 500. Female CEOs are roughly 10, 11% of the Fortune 500. Now, it's gone up over the past couple of 3 decades, but it's still, I think we can safely say, not good. Whereas CMOs, for reasons we probably want to explore on this call, it's a 50-50 mix, more women than men, just by a slight margin. Now, again, devil's in the details. Female representation changes dramatically by industry vertical, and it's the similar sorts of patterns that I talked about earlier. Healthcare has very heavy female representation. Financial services, same. Media and entertainment, pretty poor female representation, well below 50%. So it does vary by industry. The other thing that's interesting to note is that the tenure of CMOs is different for men and for women. Female tenure is less than it is for men. This is a pattern that has existed in employment data forever. It's not unusual to the CMO world. It's the same for CEOs and it's the same for CFOs.
So this has been a great conversation. I love that we have good data around just kind of framing the landscape around this really important role. So I guess a really great place to perhaps wrap this up is to look both at the B2C and the B2B side of probably the gold standard of CMOs. Like, what are they doing out there right now that we could actually give advice to say that, okay, if we want to extend CMO tenure in both these business models, like, what are the 2 or 3 things that, that the CMO should really focus on if we want to, lengthen, their time in service? So maybe, Ian, you start with the B2B side of things. What does a great B2B CMO need to do right now to be there for 10 years, not 4?
Sure. The first thing I would say is take a step back. And if you're going to look at these stats and compare yourself to these stats, look in the details. So if you're a financial services CMO, look at those stats. If you're in energy and mining, look in those stats and have a realistic understanding of what your fortunes might be as a CMO in that landscape. The specific advice I would give, I'm going to fall back on something Mike said. You need to cultivate strong working relationships with your C-suite colleagues, especially the CEO, but especially the CFO. You need to be able to demonstrate in data that you can accomplish something for the business. There needs to be a clear return on investment for what marketing does, both in the near term and the long term. And that needs to connect marketing to the revenue engine of the business. If you can do those things, then your tenure will extend dramatically. You'll be successful.
So, Mike, I gave Ian a 10-year extension from 4. That's never happening for a consumer CMO. We might get a couple extra years, but, what are the great ones doing right now? And where should maybe even an aspiring CMO, like, where should they focus their energy so they can represent marketing truly in the C-suite?
Look, I'm reticent to bring up AI because it's what everyone is talking about, and it almost feels like it is jumping the shark or has become cliche. But I have to in this case because AI, and specifically generative AI within marketing, it's disrupting the function in really big ways. I published a report in June on how AI impacts the CMO. And I was pleasantly surprised when I interviewed CMOs by just how seriously they are taking this and leaning in to leading AI vision within their companies in partnership with their heads of technology. And so for those CMOs that want to endure, they have to figure this out. They have to have a plan and a strategy and operationalize it and put together all of the infrastructure, the governance, everything that's necessary to understand and activate AI within their organizations, because it's going to have a fundamental effect on their organizational structure, on what they do, on how they do it, from across the board. So that is the number one thing that CMOs need to be leaning into right now.
I would agree. And I think the beachhead use cases for generative AI are often, very often, in marketing. So the CMO is going to be in the driver's seat here. And I would say, Mike, one of the messages of this podcast is this and other factors are making it a very exciting time to be a CMO. I think the narrative that's out there, which is all gloom and doom, is actually probably wrong. I think CMOs are going to be more powerful, more enabled, have greater resources, be more in command of their destiny than they have in the past.
And that is a great way to end this segment. Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you, Mike. This has been a great conversation, and long live the CMO.
Long live the CMO.
Thank you, Keith. Long live the CMO.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.